You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 435 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm looking back at the year 2019 and really focusing on the question, did American foreign policy make Americans safer? So I think I have a really great show planned for today. I'm going to try to get through a lot of different subjects. A lot happened in 2019, and so I'm going to try to highlight two or three different, I think, major news stories that sum up kind of what happened in 2019 best for places like Russia, North Korea, China, Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen. So a lot of good stuff on today's show. I think it'll be a good one to share. So go over to the libertarianinstitute.org. Find the show there on the homepage. You can also check out the daily news roundup that I write. It's on the homepage as well. If you're a new listener to the show, subscribe to it. It's on its own podcast feed as well as the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. And if you want to become a donor to the show, you do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right. So yeah, the big thing I'm doing on today's show is just asking the question is, did American foreign policy make Americans safer? I think it definitely in the age of American First, Donald Trump being the idea that's definitely the question, the standard that American foreign policy should be held to see if it's practically, effective. Not necessarily getting into all the morality of it, which, certainly does play in the form of blowback terrorism if you're going around the world committing crimes against people, even if, maybe it's as some kind of temporary effect to make you safer. The legacy of, the hatred you create for yourself may, be more dangerous, and there's a whole bunch of morality issues there. But I just want to look at it this way because I think Trump is even failing on this issue. And I think that's so important for everybody to understand is that it's not that this foreign policy of interventionism is what we have to do to make sure we're safe because so many people hate us around the world, but to understand that it really is actually endangering, most of us regular Americans. Now, this foreign policy does work for some people. People who contract with the government and the Pentagon, the heads of major companies, even now Amazon, Jeff Bezos is, of course, I shouldn't just lock in on Amazon when I say Jeff Bezos, because that's also the Washington Post and a lot of other little venture capitalist type firms doing a whole bunch of contracting with the Pentagon, but he wants to do more contracting. There's all these different companies, even one of Pierre Thiel's companies got $100 million or so from the Pentagon. So there's a lot of people in on this racket in the United States. And then, of course, there's the people that get to carry out the foreign policy without actually putting their lives on the line. So the different generals and think tank analysts who drive it and get donations from everyone. There's a lot of people who benefit. And, of course, not to mention the media who gets donations and has the experts from the think tanks come on their show, which, you sometimes think that'd be a conflict of interest, like Lockheed Martin pays the Atlantic Council, Lockheed Martin pays to have ads on CNN, and then CNN gives favorable coverage to people from the Atlantic Council. Like, maybe there's some kind of weird conflict, a thing that should be, at least talked about at the start of every segment on that show. I don't know. But there's a lot of people in this establishment foreign policy who do benefit from it, but the hundreds of millions of the rest of us, and especially those who are tasked with carrying out this foreign policy on the ground, absolutely suffer from it. And, that's not even starting to look at the issue of the people on the other side. So with that and kind of understanding what I'm trying to cover and how on the show today, let's get into it. Russia, I think maybe the biggest kind of stories in 2019 should revolve around, the arms control agreements, specifically the INF agreement. This is another notch on John Bolton's bedpost of treaties that he's been able to destroy. This specific treaty eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons, the rockets, the missiles that were carrying nuclear bombs between 500 kilometers and 5,500 kilometers. Those are all gone. So very important for keeping nuclear weapons out of Europe. These are also weapons that are kind of on hair trigger alerts because they come from shorter distances. There's, fear that the leaders won't have a lot of time to react. They see these missiles in the sky and, they have to make an assumption that they're nuclear. And a lot of the whole nuclear policy of if you don't use it, you lose it could, cause a lot of people to just fire off weapons. And so there's a real threat that this would be something that could either accidentally or actually, in one country trying to carry out a nuclear first strike, trigger a larger nuclear war. There's also the issue that, this would now allow the U.S. to mount nuclear weapons. And we've, designed some new nuclear weapons in the recent years, small enough to fit on our Tomahawk missiles. And then these new low yield ones, which are, some kind of tactical or strategic use. The think tankers call them, but really what they are, lower yield use, meaning that the U.S. would be more likely to use them, especially under somebody like a President Trump. You'd think maybe get talked into using one of these things, thinking that, hey, if we show we're willing to use a small nuclear bomb, they'll think, well, they're probably willing to use a big one too and bat the other side down. But, this is an awfully kind of dangerous strategy to go down. And so the U.S. putting they are at least now having the capability, it's not without a treaty that Russia inspects for, putting nuclear weapons on these Tomahawk missiles, I'm sure is a real threat for Russia, especially since we use them conventionally all the time. All right, now there's also the New START treaty, and I think this will be a bigger story in 2020 than 2019, but we start to see the Trump administration policy on it take shape during 2019. This is so important. This is really the last remaining arms control agreement between the United States and Russia that limits the number of nuclear weapons the two countries have. You look at the U.S., who is now planning to spend billions of dollars at this point, but it'll probably, end up in the hundreds of billions, if not more, on revamping our nuclear program, including, new bombers, new submarines, new Minuteman missiles, and without the constraints of the New START treaty, then maybe as we're ramping up the nuclear program, it makes sense to produce more and more bombs, just kind of like how the Congress will give the Pentagon even more F-35s and Abrams tanks that they request because, some congressman somewhere has a tank factory in their district, and so it's awfully good for jobs and stuff if you produce more tanks. And likewise, the similar things will happen with other weapons and up to and including nuclear weapons. I mean, there's an industry and a lobby behind it. And without the cap of these arms control agreements, we're going to really start going the wrong way. There's also been some talk about removing the U.S. from the Open Skies Treaty with Russia, which allows surveillance flights of each other's countries over, so the United States could fly missions over Russia, Russia could fly missions over the United States to keep an eye on what other countries are doing militarily. And I think a lot of times, because there's just so many hawks who profit so much off of this, often the threats are inflated, and this is, real intelligence that says, maybe things aren't so hostile as they appear, and there's less need for a hostile policy on our end. I want to just kind of lump the Ukraine situation in with Russia here, because the United States gave military aid to Ukraine in 2019, which is, a bad thing. We've maintained the policy that Crimea is a part of Ukraine and Russia must give it back before we relieve sanctions. We've sanctioned Russia for 2016 election interference, and those are still in place for the Skripal poisoning in the UK. And a part of the 2020 NDAA, we've also sanctioned Russia and their construction pipelines going to bring natural gas and different kinds of energy into Europe, the Nord Stream 2 and Turkish Stream 2 pipelines. And then sanctioning Russia over crimes committed in Syria with the Caesar bill that was, again, both in the 2020 NDAA. So, that policy of sanctions towards Russia is certainly more hawkish than Obama was, on sanctions and on the Ukraine issue, where Obama had refused to give the lethal aid. Another part of the 2020 NDAA is there's more lethal aid in there for Ukraine. And I just saw this morning that Ukraine intends to buy more Javelin anti-tank missiles. The real problem with providing lethal aid to Ukraine is the neo-Nazi elements within the Ukrainian military now that supported the coup government that came to power in Kiev in 2014. And while, there's a new administration there, and, I believe even the former neo-Nazi Speaker of Parliament has lost that authority and position, obviously the very right-wing elements in Ukraine continue to exist, even though they don't maybe hold as much political power. However, I know they've, threatened to come out in the streets in the past year and everything like that. And the U.S. emboldening this government, and, particularly the military elements with these Javelin missiles seems particularly dangerous and unnecessary. I mean, there's been times in the past that people in Congress have issued like different kinds of bills that say you can't arm Nazis. Well, it's directed at providing military aid to the Ukrainians. So I think pretty much across the board in 2019, steps backwards as far as U.S. and Russian relations go. Just seeing kind of more of this consensus. Also, unfortunately, too, that Russia interfered in the 2016 election, and we have to combat them from interfering in the 2020 election. This kind of hysteria could really create a new Cold War, especially when on the Democrat side of the issue, one of these characters could win, who've been all in on this Hillary only lost the election and we only had Trump because of Russia narrative. And who knows how aggressive of a stance they could take. So Trump needs to get some kind of arms control deal done or extension a new start with Russia in 2020. It'll help his re-election campaign, which, I don't personally care about getting Trump re-elected, but if he cares, he should do that. And overall, I think it's good for the rest of us because generally Americans don't favor of having a nuclear war with Russia. We understand that it's a fairly genocidal for all of us kind of attempt there. So I think overall 2019 took steps in the wrong direction, more towards the new Cold War, more towards arms buildup, developing new kinds of nuclear weapons, getting out of these different treaties, more sanctions against Russia. That said, I guess Donald Trump seems to still have the possibility of just kind of fixing things with Putin, as we'll see in the rest of the show. He's kind of all over the place on some of his foreign policy issues. He's good on them, he's bad on them. He says he's going to withdraw, but then he doesn't. And so if he goes a different direction, that would be a great thing. Looking at China now, I would say it seems like the biggest issue here is actually tariffs, which I don't think I have anything really unique on. My general position is less tariffs are the better. I think Trump's trade war, economic war against China has been just as foolish as his economic war against Iran, North Korea, or Venezuela. But there are a couple other things going on between the U.S. and China that I do think are important to foreign policy and that I have a little bit more to add on. The first is the protests going on through the second half of 2019 in Hong Kong. There are certainly legitimate reasons for the people of Hong Kong to be upset, to protest their leadership, as well as what they see as increasing control of their semi-autonomous city-state by the, much larger Chinese state. That said, it's not on the American government to support that, and by the U.S., supporting different NGOs and providing different kinds of diplomatic or support for Hong Kong, it makes U.S.-Chinese relationship much more difficult. And honestly, as an American, looking at my own safety, the relationship between the U.S. and Beijing is far more important than the relationship between U.S. and Hong Kong. So I think there needs to be a little bit of a reality factor here for Americans. Realize that China is a state with like 1.3 billion people. They have a nuclear triad. While they don't possess, necessarily an offensive threat against the Americans, they definitely do possess the ability to defend their area and retaliate and, act as a deterrent against the Americans. So we could really only escalate so far on this issue, and it does seem like should it go to that level, China would have the ability to kind of just seize and keep the Americans out of Hong Kong, far more likely than the U.S. could do anything to cause Beijing to lose a whole lot of influence in Hong Kong. And in fact, I guess the only thing the Americans could do with this aid is just cause Beijing to maybe overstep a little bit, and it might, make Hong Kongers generally more skeptical of Beijing, but it'll be a hell of a price to pay for whoever in Hong Kong ends up on the receiving end of that Chinese overreaction. So, that's a complicated one, I think, in general for libertarians who, Like when I look at Spain and Catalonia, I'm very supportive of their independence bid there. It's a nonviolent kind of thing. Now, one of the, I guess, issues with Hong Kong that I could get into now is that the protests are not nonviolent, and I don't think there's any standard to say that all protest movements have to be nonviolent. But the way it's discussed by the American media that the protesters are on the nonviolent side and that they are being abused by the police. I mean, if you look at how the American police responded in Ferguson versus how the Hong Kong police have responded to these 6 months of protests, I mean, I see protesters out there with bow and arrows, hitting people with Brits, all kinds of very Molotov cocktails, petrol bombs, all these weapons. And so far, only one person, I believe, has been shot and killed by police. Another person fell off a balcony that was initially blamed on police, but I think that's pretty questionable at this point if that was, a situation where the police killed someone. So, again, not trying to cover up the police violence in Hong Kong because there has been some, but there is violence by the protesters as well. One old man was, I think, trying to clean up the street and was hit by a brick thrown by a protester, and that killed him. I've seen harassment of people, particularly people who are supportive of either just the government of Hong Kong led by Carrie Lam or the Beijing state in general, but there's a lot of violence and hostility there. I think the wrong step is for the U.S. government to take official positions, in support of the Hong Kong protesters. If individual politicians want to, I think that's a little bit of a different issue, but they shouldn't be passing resolutions on it. Certainly shouldn't be sanctioning China or anything like that. And we've had some laws like that in the kind of latter couple months here of 2019. I think a couple things included in the 2020 NDAA on Hong Kong. So those are steps in the wrong direction. Then there is the South China Sea territorial issue where the United States continue to sail these, what they call freedom of navigation routes, through islands, in the South China Sea claimed by China. Kind of like Hong Kong, again, this is territory that strategically China would be able to control and I think keep from the United States. And while it does seem like China is probably overstepping some international agreements on how territorial waters are supposed to be drawn up with their claims in the South China Sea, that's not for America to decide. Taiwan, we've ramped up weapon sales and kind of political and diplomatic support to Taiwan in the past year. I know China has taken some steps and accessed some diplomacy that they've purchased through their Belt and Loan program loans, where they're giving out development loans, kind of like the West does with the IMF all over the place. And they've gotten a lot of airports in different countries to change their signs for Taiwan to have the Chinese flag next to them rather than independent Taiwanese flag. And it just seems like that's kind of the position that China is working right now when it comes to Taiwan. But you had to wonder how much of this is, they're concerned that the United States uses Taiwan to have a whole bunch of American weapons on the island. We sail our warships through the Taiwan Strait, which, separates Taiwan and Russia. Taiwan and China. So it's not very far from China when we have our warships going through there. On North Korea, looking back at 2019 and along with Syria, I think all the expectations and hypes and the hope that, Donald Trump could do something a little bit different and something great in bringing some more peace in the world definitely didn't happen. At the end of 2018, going into 2019, there's a lot of optimism about the summit coming up in Hanoi. You have the U.S. leader of talks with North Korean Stephen Biegun, who's saying that, hey, the U.S. is maybe looking at a different approach to things, which sounds great because the approach that the U.S. taken up until this point was the North Koreans have to give up everything up front and then maybe we'll give some sanctions or relief later. This is something that the North Koreans obviously weren't going to accept, particularly as I'll talk about next, the U.S. policy with Iran, where we got the Iranians to give up parts of their nuclear program up front and then we went ahead and put sanctions on them anyways. So that happens. Lead up to Hanoi. Apparently the National Security Advisor through most of 2019, John Bolton, got some influence with Trump right before the summit. And when the North Koreans came, and I really believe they were expecting some kind of deal or at least positive summit to happen with the Americans. They came and Donald Trump said, you have to give up all of your WMD up front. North Korea said no, the summit ended early. And that kind of kicked off this period of the next few months where relations were icy. Trump and North Korea exchanged some letters. There was, I believe, a summit either in Sweden or Switzerland where the North Koreans only attended for a few hours, saying again the U.S. is bringing nothing new to the table. Starting kind of late spring, early summer, North Korea carries out weapons tests. Donald Trump says, not a big deal because they're not a part of their nuclear program, so it doesn't violate freeze for freeze. Although it is significant that during the time of diplomacy, between Singapore and Hanoi, North Korea did refrain from testing any weapons. I guess as a sign that, thinking maybe peace could work and trying to give it a chance. In June, we had the DMZ meeting between Trump, Kim, and South Korean President Moon Jae-in. John Bolton was noticeably sidelined, well, not sidelined, sent to Mongolia for this one, and Tucker Carlson actually attended the meeting. So again, optimism, thinking, hey, something positive may happen here. Kim Jong-un had previously sent an end of the year deadline for talks to improve with North Korea, but this seemed like a great start to that. However, the U.S. and South Korea had these war games planned coming up. North Korea said, well, if you don't cancel the war games, we're not going to engage in talks. U.S. didn't cancel the war games. North Koreans didn't engage in talks. And we kind of entered this cycle through the fall of this year where you have from the Trump administration warnings towards the North Koreans and from the North Koreans warnings back toward the Trump administration saying that, hey, we need to engage in meaningful talks. And they carried out some weapons tests. This ends up with a test happening at a engine facility, a long-range missiles engine facility. They carried out 2 of those in December, and Trump and Kim seem to have cut off all their friendly letters and have resorted back to the name-calling. So overall, a pretty poor year for North Korean relations. I suppose it is not impossible for Trump to figure out some kind of deal that he could get done with North Korea, but when you look at what the North Koreans have seen over the past year, and probably their skepticism of how long it's going to take to negotiate a deal, the possibility of Trump not being reelected anyways, maybe they're not very willing to negotiate in 2020 at all. It's certainly a possibility, and this is something that Tim Chirac is praying forward. We did expect, I did on the show up until I read Tim's article, and just about everybody else in the U.S. expected some kind of Christmas gift from Kim Jong-un. He had talked about that idea. However, it didn't actually end up happening, and there was no major Korean weapons test on Christmas Day at all. And so now we're waiting, I guess, for New Year's Day to see if North Korea announces any kind of new policy or a new weapons test. All right, Iran. The U.S. policy on Iran kind of stays the same throughout 2019, where Trump had already announced he was getting out of the nuclear deal. I believe it's the end of 2018 that Trump has reimposed most of the oil sanctions. Any countries that were getting waivers to continue to import Iranian oil, I believe those have now been cut off, although Iran is still exporting some oil to countries, I guess, that are already in violation of U.S. sanctions and don't really care about secondary sanctions. The U.S. has sanctioned some of the other Iranian industries that were, agreed to have the sanctions lifted in the nuclear deal throughout 2019, or have just sanctioned other people, different leaderships in Iran. The foreign minister who actually negotiated the nuclear deal the first time around was sanctioned. People around the Ayatollah, people around the president. Year of sanctions for Iran would be a good way to look at that and review. So the Iranian economy was hurting some. Eventually this led to some protests in Iran and some strong statements by the Americans about that. But overall, the maximum pressure campaign isn't threatening the Iranian regime like the Americans, I'm supposing, were hoping for. And when I say Americans, I mean American Trump administration leadership. So, the policy doesn't progress in overthrowing the regime in 2020. There's some times of very close hostility. A U.S. drone was shot down when it was flying in Iranian airspace. The Trump administration and Donald Trump himself said we came very close to carrying out a attack, but was walked back in the past minute. realizing that an unarmed drone being shot down isn't worth killing a bunch of Iranians for. But a very hostile year with Iran in 2019. And being hostile towards Iran doesn't make Americans any safer. I mean, if there was a nuclear threat from Iran, it was taken care of by the nuclear deal, which Donald Trump withdrew from. But there's not a nuclear threat from Iran anyways, so we really don't need to even go down that road. But looking at Iran's capabilities, they're all defensive. And so the only way that Americans get killed by Iranians if it's Americans in the Middle East fighting a war against Iran. And, you know, Iran, like, again, isn't trying to build a nuclear bomb. It's not the top fundraiser of terrorism throughout the world. And we don't have any threats from Iran or Iranians as Americans. And, you know, the situation here is just honestly to get back in the nuclear deal, I suppose, and just restart the relationship off the right way this time around. It seems likely to happen under Trump. But I think one of the problems is the Iranians are saying that, you know, they're not going to give any more and that the Trump administration has to come back to the nuclear deal. And it seems like it would be politically too much of a loss for Trump to happen in 2020. And so a part of me is just hoping that for 2020 things don't get too much worse as far as it goes with Iran. And then hopefully getting one of the Democrats elected president that will run on somewhat Trump made a mistake getting out of the nuclear deal that the great Obama negotiated, and getting back into it is the way to go forward, which it will work out. All right, everybody. I planned to get through a couple more today, but it took a little bit more time talking about some of them than I thought. So I will do a lot of this in the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Africa on likely the next show, but potentially the show on New Year's Eve. So look forward to that next week. Let me know if you have anything that you would like me to cover or hear about, or something that you think I skipped over too much on today's show. More than happy to get to that next week. You could do that at the private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus, or you could, either send me a message or tweet at me at KYAAALE on Twitter. You find all my work at the Libertarian Institute, and donate to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.